selamat pagi menjelang siang semua. Itu saya
sudah kelihatan, sudah muncul.
Sudah, ya. Dan sudah dengar juga?
Ya, sudah.
Ya, oke.
Betul, sudah terdengar.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to this presentation. I was very pleased to be invited by Ibu Ratih to do this little gig with you. It's always a good opportunity to talk to students and staff of different universities. So there will mungkin sedikit overlap ya dengan Ibu Ratih, but I also would like to clarify some things from my perspective and my experience, because we, in the area of communication for development and social change, we are really trying to look at the field of development from quite a critical perspective. Kita tidak hanya menerima model yang biasa saja, tapi juga lebih melihat bagaimana ada manfaat untuk semua orang. Itu akan di-share. Okay, so what I will do, I'll just talk about two areas, but they are actually quite broad areas. So just like Ibu Ratih did, we'll have to talk about development first to understand actually what communication for development and social change is. But I would like to take you through a little bit of the history of development and then show you ideas for another development untuk semacam pembangunan yang akan lebih baik untuk semua orang, and social change, what that means. And I'd like to share with you some observations first. Pertama kali saya ke Indonesia itu mungkin kebanyakan dari teman-teman yang di sini belum lahir, itu Desember tahun 1988. Waktu saya ke Jogja masih banyak becak, masih banyak sepeda. And now we can see in most cities in Indonesia, and even in the rural areas, lots of motorbikes, lots of cars. And of course, the consequence of that is lots of macet, a lot of air pollution. So we also see that in the last 30 years, that we've gone from a dependency, ketergantungan pada bantuan, to models of Indonesian government more working with other governments in the form of aid for trade. Pasar menjadi lebih penting untuk menentukan pembangunan daripada hanya pembangunan dari segi di tingkat lapangan. And so there have been trade agreements, there have been regional and global alliances, and they've all influenced the way we look at development. We know that education got better. A lot of people finish in a school, they go to university. Many people go overseas, like Ibu Ratih, and maybe some of you in the future, but few people want to be farmers. So who's going to grow our food in the future? Also, people got taller, there's better nutrition. I've definitely observed that in Indonesia, that's the case as well. But also we see that more Western or local fast food outlets, have caused more diet and related health problems. So, and I'm showing these observations because we've seen enormous changes, or at least I've observed enormous changes, many for the good in Indonesia and in other countries in the region. But also, there's always a flip side to that. And some areas haven't changed a bit. A lot of my work still has been in the eastern parts of Indonesia, for instance, Timor Barat, Timor-Leste juga, Lombok, Sumbawa, and there's still a lot of people who go hungry part of the year after they've run out of the products they harvested. There's still people who demonstrate for $3 a day, so it's not about democracy, it's just about getting an income. One day you demonstrate for A, and tomorrow you demonstrate for B. Doesn't matter what it's about. And also in development, there has been a lot of reinventing the wheel. So it was a good question that Ibu Ratih asked, have we forgotten about communication for development or what's actually happening? But I see a lot of things are coming back in circles and are actually never finished or institutionalized in a proper way. And we see that a lot of development initiatives are increasingly not suitable for those who miss the bandwagon. The gap between the rich and the poor is still getting bigger. And I'll show that to you in a minute. So we look at those different phases of development, the good, the bad, and the ugly, but also a little bit of hope. So very quickly, you see this picture is what's happened in the ASEAN countries in terms of GDP, which is often used as an indicator for development, an economic indicator. And we see that Indonesia is actually the level of poverty has really reduced. You know, in 2018 was below 10%. Although still it's a very big bubble, which means there's a lot of people there who actually still live under the poverty level. And if we actually look at some of the situation in Indonesia, the ASEAN Post in 2018 reported that the 4 richest people in Indonesia, only 4 people, have more wealth than the poorest 100 million people. You know, that is like, you know, almost half of the, well, it's like a third of the country, which is incredible. The top 1% of the people in Indonesia, the top 1 richest people, own 50% of the country's wealth. But that's not very different in the US, you know, where the top 1% earn about 40% of the country's wealth, you know, in a country where there is a lot more wealth to distribute. So we can then question ourselves, is that a kind of development we want? You know, that there's so many people who are poor, but there's a few people who are very, very rich. And so development, yes, it is a change process, but it should be change for the better and for all. And we've seen there's been a lot of change over the past 30, 40, 50 years for the better, but also some for the worse in terms of, you know, the things we've looked at earlier, air pollution and health-related problems and things like that. Development should also be have a focus on well-being, bukan hanya kekayaan, tapi juga kesejahteraan secara keseluruhan itu. And that relates to actually having options to choose in a way that is best for you. You know, people have different aspirations and they need to have options, and therefore they need to have access, and not one size fits all. It just does not work that way. And we've seen that in history. So therefore it is about power as well. It's a power to decide on the direction of change for yourself and your families. So empowerment, you know, is a very important term in that kind of development where we hope a change for the better for all. Empowerment, yeah, is just a key concept actually in communication for social change particularly. So we have to question ourselves, what does it mean change for the better? Is it being wealthier, have more land or stuff, or more children, or be healthier, be more secure? It depends on the person. We cannot decide for other people what is better for them. And we also always have to think about how does change in one area impact on other aspects of life. We can say, well, maybe we suddenly earn a lot more money, but we have to work like 14 hours a day. And how does it affect our mental health? How does it affect our families? How does it affect, you know, the well-being of our children who don't get proper attention? So what does it then mean for the future generations? And we have to think about how does change for one group impact on other groups? For instance, if you're as a big company, you cut down a lot of forest because you wanted to make some big business there. Of course, people who lived from the forest before, they lose their livelihood. So there's always a conflict in development. So development paradigms, they have therefore responded to that. And initially, and this was actually what Ibu Ratih was talking about, the Orde Baru in Indonesia, which was really post-World War, Second World War, in 1960s and on for about 20, 25 years. And we often call that modernization. So it was inspired by the rebuilding of Europe with the influence of the United States after the Second World War. It was about this progressive transition from being traditional to being modern, and there was, you know, and that under influence of science and technology. But then development was really about using that technology for economic growth. So the main indicator for the modernization kind of form of development is economic growth. And until now, that is still a very important indicator, very often actually still the most important. And it came, as also Ibu Ratih just showed, with top-down planning, implementation, evaluation of programs, very much government-led. It could be bilateral between two governments with aid coming in, or multilateral with the United Nations. And as I said, the indicators were income, GDP, and growth. But we know, and we've already kind of touched on this, there was the other side of economic growth, like environmental degradation, food safety issues, health problems, the loss of culture, indigenous knowledge, traditions, social inequality, and that gap that's becoming wider, and conflicting interests. So then in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was, as particularly influenced by the big forum, the World Commission on Environment and Development, there was a real push towards sustainable development. And that's really when the meaning of also communication for development started to change. So sustainable development, and so pembangunan berkelanjutan, is defined as the development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Dan so bagaimana kita bisa mengamankan itu masa depan untuk anak-anak dan cucu kita. Dari segi lingkungan yang masih sehat, juga dari segi ekonomi yang masih mendukung, dari segi kesehatan manusia masih baik. Then the dimensions there are not just economic growth, but it is economic viability, which is not always maximum growth, but it is sustainable kind of growth. But very important, also social justice and the protection of the environment and political commitment for sustained action and actually improvements for more people, not just the richest. So we see then the sustainable livelihood became very important, and that looked not only at the financial capital, at the economic bits, but also natural, at the environment, human kind of development, the social development, and the physical, which is prasarana, the infrastructure. So, and then the indicators became livelihood indicators. Ya, itu indikator kehidupan, bukan hanya indikator ekonomi. Yes, more income, because the world eventually needs that bit of economic growth, but also increased well-being, reduced vulnerability, as people tidak mudah kena suatu shock, apa itu dari iklim atau dari ekonomi, improved food security, and sustainable use of the natural resource base untuk melanjutkan masa depannya juga. Ibu Rati already showed the Millennium Development Goals. What I'm showing here is that a lot of those targets were actually not achieved by 2015. And that was when there was a real rethinking done. These 8 goals also mainly applied to the so-called developing countries, whereas it was then realized when many of these were not achieved is you cannot achieve this if the agenda is not applied to the whole world. So, and that's what the Sustainable Development Goals do. So more goals, many more targets, and it is applying to the whole world, including poor countries, middle income countries, and rich countries, because we have to work together on this agenda. It influences each other. You cannot end poverty in one place if you actually, take advantage of that country as a rich country. So it is about particularly ending extreme poverty, fighting inequality, injustice, and fixing climate change, which is now a huge influence on any part of development. And you see some progress is being made, but it's still very, very hard to achieve that by 2030. And particularly now that we are in the middle of a pandemic that had huge impact on a lot of those indicators. So we have a lot of work to do. With that came 2 global trends that I have to highlight here. One is what we often call neoliberalism, which is economic policies that aim for market-driven approach to economic development. And they really became important around, 2008, onwards. So from, more that focus in a lot of development programs on sustainable development, suddenly there became things like public-private partnerships and, getting a lot more of the private sector involved in running, the development function. So there's privatization, free trade, open markets, deregulation. You're all familiar with that. But it was a real change in how we thought about development, and actually a real change in how governments stand in that, because that suddenly implied much less spending on a lot of those functions of development and leaving it to the private sector. And they became then from the provider of public welfare to a promoter of markets and competition. And that, of course, again, actually breaks down some of that sustainability and social justice agenda, because again, it is the people who are already well off, of what I often call they're already on the bandwagon of change, who can take advantage of that and go further. And the ones who, are not there yet, whether it's a country or a community or a family, they fall very often between the cracks. And we've seen that with a lot of, smallholder farmers, for instance, in Indonesia, falling between those cracks and not benefiting from this new market kind of focused way of dealing with development. So the consequence for communication here is that it is often run more by for commercial purposes and by commercial companies as well. And that, of course, everything has become digital because it is all worldwide, and the technology is also allowing for that now. But it takes power away from the people, from the smaller kind of, the people who can afford less. And then, of course, related to that is the second trend, that's the digital age, which is in the title of this seminar. We often call that the information age or the internet age, which is really explained by that it's a world economy based on information and communication technology. So we've seen that transition from face-to-face communication or print, like newspapers or books or radio, community radio or national radio, and TV and analog forms, to internet, information through internet, available everywhere you are. Satellite TV, again, that goes through the internet and satellite, you can access everywhere. Mobile phones, to that, the whole digital system. So again, that has huge implications about, who owns the power to make that available, who has, enough, who can actually afford to, for it to be accessible. So there are a lot of things, and we all, probably some of you are studying this whole notion of the digital divide, and because of communication information becoming so digital, we get again a widening gap of those of the poor and the rich, or those who have power and those who don't. So another development was really a concept that was built on a lot of the sustainable development kind of thinking and of the experiences, particularly in areas where social justice was very important. So, and it's a very nice little book by Wendy Quarry and Ricardo Ramirez, which I can recommend you read at some stage. So it's about sustainability, but also particularly equity. It is about empowered citizens. Bagaimana orang bisa betul-betul memiliki itu kekuasaannya sendiri. It is about cultural recognition as well. It has more holistic approaches requiring more transdisciplinary collaborations. It's not just about quick fixes or technological fixes in one area, because that will have impact on other areas. It is about educating people, and particularly developing critical skills of people to be able to make better decisions, and what we often call conscientization. It's about understanding your situation, understanding your needs for change, understanding the options, not top-down, telling what is better for you. So therefore, it implies participation, setting agendas, participation in setting the agendas, in planning, in implementation, and in evaluation. So, and of course, participatory approaches were already part since the early 90s in sustainable development, but they came and went, and they come up again, and they go again and they come up again. So because they're hard to implement. But I'll explain next why they are so important if we want to have if we want to have development as well as social change. So social change, I kind of usually, social change, perubahan sosial, is often kind of misinterpreted. Very often it's just used as a term for, perubahan di sistem sosial, but it's the way we actually, in the critical kind of field we look at it, is that it actually involves a change in the power dynamics. So it is about becoming empowered, becoming, taking charge rather than, having the people with power taking charge of your lives. And so that requires a different approach. You need, when you're little, like in this picture, you don't have a lot of power and you get the same as everyone else. You don't access the same. So that's a bit sad. So you need equity first to be able to achieve equality. You need to lift up the people who have less before they can, compete in the game. So it's not just about any social project or only behavioral economic change. So what does it mean for communication for development and social change? How do we make that change for the better and for all happen on the ground? So I have to go back to that, to the early 60s, that kind of modernization and the Orde Baru, and it was the whole communication approach was transfer of technology. So it was technology centered, it was linear and top down, it was about diffusion and adoption theories. You probably have learned about Everett Rogers and seen some of that in communication theory. And it recognizes those stages of adoption. And then those who don't adopt were actually called laggards, which is so sad, to be called a laggard, whereas you may not actually be in a need for that technology, or you may not be able to adopt that technology, not because you don't want or can, but because you just don't have the money, or because you're far away from the shops or whatever. There may be many reasons. So it's very technology centered. And that's really what we often call development communication. And in Indonesia, that was called komunikasi pembangunan under that Orde Baru, and it was very top down. It had the penyuluh pertanian and penyuluh kesehatan, and they just sent messages, in little chunks, and people were just to follow that. But there was no adaptation to specific personal circumstances. So then a participatory communication processes came in more as 1990s. You've probably all heard about participatory, bottom-up processes. It is about involving people in assessing their situation, their needs, opportunities, shared decision-making, involvement of stakeholders in the planning, implementation, and evaluation. And communication is then not only giving information, whether it is face-to-face or through media or through internet, it is facilitation of dialogue or of exchange, and also providing access and capacity for people to have access to information, to innovation, and to learning opportunities, and being able to also assess what is the best for you. So this is a long definition of then communication for development. And I want to emphasize here, it's different when we use the word development communication in English or over communication for development. Development communication has a connotation of the World Bank, and I'll show that in a second. Actually, you can read this formulation later. It's all about supporting people in their change rather than actually telling them what to do. So here are these confusing acronyms. So DEFCON, that transfer of technology model, World Bank, that was really used for the top down, whereas when it became more participatory, all the partners in development started to call it communication for development. So in Indonesian, we can call that, say, komunikasi untuk pembangunan instead of just kombang atau komunikasi pembangunan. And it has a very different meaning because one is top down, the other is supposed to be bottom up. But then even within the UN, like between FAO and UNICEF, they couldn't agree on acronyms. Some use COMDEV, others C for D. Then we started to use communication for social change, which is more or less the same actually. And now UNICEF and some partners are using both social and behavioral change communication. So it is both challenging power structures, but also influencing people behaviors, which, like particularly in a pandemic, just the message to wash your hands, you don't really have to debate that, you just have to do it. So, that is important as well. And then of course, now with internet, information and communication technologies, we have the ICT for development kind of concept as well. And so Indonesia, as we've seen earlier, the komunikasi pembangunan was their transfer technology model. And in the reformasi period, I put here, it's actually gado-gado. There's a lot of talk about participatory processes, and there have been projects and there have been trainings of staff, but still the structures of the institutions in Indonesia, very often, particularly government institutions, don't really allow for that long-term participatory empowerment kind of focused communication processor to support that kind of, more another development or that more sustainable development. We've seen the rise and also the fall of PRA, participatory rural appraisal, like, approaches to integrate participation, which was done very superficially. If I look at it, what happened, particularly in government institutions in Indonesia, NGOs, usually much better. And we've seen telecenters being put in, SMS centers, other digital approaches, which I call here one size fits all, but they actually did not fit all approaches. Like putting out an SMS center, sending simple messages to people is not going to solve complex problems that people face in a rural community in Sumba, for instance, where they're facing a lot of kind of difficulties. So yes, the internet is very important and provides a lot of opportunities, but you really, for that sustainable change, you really need to look at, what does it do? What functions does it serve? And I try to cover that now. So if we look at the future of communication for development and social change, so if we look at sustainability, achieving sustainability, there is no one size fits all. It is about very location specific, adaptable systems, where we need to look at supporting people with what they need, not what we think is best for them, but what they need. And therefore, sometimes in a position they need more, or they need less first before they can achieve better things. And that's why I say the need for equity to achieve equality. For instance, farmers that I worked with in Kupang, in Timor Barat, what we learned is that all the government programs were trying to get them to graduate from SMA, whereas they weren't even kind of, ready for SD, right? Yeah, I'm using that as a metaphor because, whatever they had, all the technologies that were introduced, they needed money, they needed sophisticated knowledge, they needed to have links with the markets. They weren't ready there yet. They had to graduate first through, slow steps and enhancing their skills, enhancing their wealth, enhancing their ability to turn their farms into more commercial systems. And they had to graduate from SD first before they could actually enter SMP, SMA. And you can't just use the same model that works well on research stations with farmers who have very different situations. So, and then the digital communication, yes, there is a future for that. It means we can provide a lot of information very fast and very wide, but very often that kind of, communication mainly raises awareness. It sends out messages, it may kind of influence public opinion, but it doesn't really develop the practical and particularly not the critical skills that often people need before they can truly change. Before they can make use of the opportunities that are there to change. So, and while digital communication means they can be inclusive, they can be democratizing, but you have to design it really well, having just things on social media where people, put a thumbs up and share ideas is not necessarily helpful. It could be an overflow of information, it's not directed, it may not be accessible to the people who need it most. So you have to design it really well. And that's why it's not a quick fix. I've seen lots of ICT projects come up over the past 15 years. Because they're tired of doing all the participatory stuff, which is hard. It takes time, but it actually makes a difference if you do it well. But the ICT project came up to have just quick fixes. Well, they didn't fix anything or not much. So what you really need still is the need for, or you need you need those face-to-face kind of communication to really have this dialogue, that people make sense of what the options are for them. And you need adaptable communication means and interactive means. And they are very powerful in that sense, particularly when you need that. You need deep knowledge, you need the development of skills and critical skills building, and also when you need dialogue and conflict resolution and power negotiation, which is what we still need in sustainable development, and particularly this another development where we also look at social justice and a better world for all. So so there's a lot to still do in terms of using all communication means in the best possible combination. And it is all about, not trying to find quick fixes, but really integrating it. So some of the areas that Iburati mentioned earlier that you are doing in programs now, like, where you look at media skills and marketing and things, they can be useful as well in communication for development, but particularly in communication for sustainable development and social change. We need that participatory communication, and we need that kind of engagement. We need that empowerment functions. We need advocacy. We need to be able to, someone to stand up for the people who are not in an equal position yet. We need to be more participatory, educational communication when it comes to, understanding options and understanding policies, so that people can actually make sense out of what is available for them. So there's a huge role for people who can use communication and communication strategies creatively and use all those different functions and support development. In terms of whether it has been forgotten, actually UGM, Universitas Gadjah Mada, and also IPB in Bogor, they still have master's programs in communication for development, particularly linked to agricultural and rural development programs. So they're still there. We've seen a huge interest at Universitas Indonesia and Universitas Brawijaya for programs on communication for social change, and we're working with them on possibly designing some programs. So it's definitely not dead, it's definitely not gone or forgotten. We just have to redesign it and give better meaning. So don't call it komunikasi pembangunan with Orde Baru in your head, but think about komunikasi untuk pembangunan berkelanjutan. And that can really support a change for the better for all. And the future is you, the new generation. So in the end, it's about what choices you will make and how you will contribute to the pembangunan and negara Indonesia. Thanks very much.